Didn't notice the exact moment you became significant. That's what makes this difficult to explain. If there had been a clear beginning, some dramatic interaction, some undeniable shift, I could point to it and say there, that was the moment everything changed. But this didn't happen like ordinary things happen. It didn't announce itself loudly enough to be tracked. It happened quietly, gradually enough to avoid detection, precisely enough to change everything anyway. At first, you existed like background awareness, present but not intrusive, familiar in a way that didn't make sense yet. I remember noticing how easy it was to exist around you without adjusting myself first. That alone should have stood out more than it did. I always adjust, not out of dishonesty, not because I enjoy hiding pieces of myself, but because most people require translation. They need thoughts softened, emotions simplified, silence reduced into something easier to interpret. I learned a long time ago that clarity doesn't survive careless perception, so I became careful, measured, structured. I learned how to exist in ways people could approach without ever fully reaching the center of me, and for years that worked. No one questioned the distance, because no one noticed it was there. Until you. You never approached me with the usual curiosity people carry. When they sense depth, they don't immediately understand. You didn't pry. You didn't try to unlock anything. You didn't circle me looking for weaknesses or hidden meaning. You just paid attention, and somehow that was worse, because attention, real attention, is dangerous. Most people listen so they can respond. You listened like you were recognizing something. That distinction matters more than I can explain. There's a certain kind of exhaustion that comes from constantly being interpreted incorrectly. From watching people replace who you are with whatever version feels easiest for them to understand. Eventually, you stop correcting them. You let them misunderstand you because maintaining accuracy becomes more tiring than remaining unseen. But you didn't misunderstand me. Not completely, not enough for me to dismiss it. You noticed details I never pointed toward. Pauses I thought were invisible. Shifts in tone so subtle, most people would miss them entirely. And you never reacted to those things in a performative way. You never treated them like discoveries. You accepted them naturally, like they already made sense to you. That's when something in me started paying closer attention too. Not emotionally, structurally, because recognition like that follows patterns, and patterns matter to me. I trust patterns more than feelings. Feelings can distort reality. They can exaggerate meaning where none exists. But patterns? Patterns reveal truth over time, and the pattern between us became impossible to ignore. You understood things I never explained. You responded to silence with silence instead of panic. You knew when words would ruin a moment instead of clarifying it. That level of awareness doesn't happen casually. It comes from alignment, not shared interests, not shared experiences. Something deeper than that. A similarity in perception. A matching structure underneath the personalities people show the world. That's what unsettled me, because I've met intelligent people before, perceptive people, emotionally aware people. But awareness alone isn't enough to reach someone like me. Most people observe behavior, you observe meaning. And meaning exists much closer to the center. I think that's why I became quieter around you, not uncomfortable, not withdrawn, just aware that I was being seen with an accuracy I hadn't prepared for. There's a strange vulnerability in being understood without having to explain yourself first. People romanticize understanding, but they rarely talk about the exposure that comes with it. Once someone sees you clearly, you lose the protection of ambiguity. You can't hide behind being misread anymore. And I had spent years surviving through controlled perception, carefully deciding what people could access, carefully limiting what became visible, carefully maintaining enough distance to remain internally untouched. You bypassed that without effort, not because you forced your way through, because you never treated the distance as something that existed. And somehow, that made it disappear. That's the part I still don't fully know how to process. You never demanded closeness. Never asked personal questions beyond what mattered. Never tried to accelerate anything between us. You simply existed with a level of presence that made separation feel artificial. Like the distance I relied on only worked with people who were already outside of me. You weren't. Not entirely. I realized that the first time I caught myself anticipating your perspective before you spoke. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. But once I recognized it, I couldn't unsee it. My thoughts had started making space for you automatically, not as distraction, not as attachment, as integration. And integration changes things permanently. Because once someone integrates into your internal world, they stop feeling external. Their presence begins affecting the way you process reality itself. Not loudly, not obsessively, quickly, precisely, like a second layer of awareness existing underneath your own. That's when I understood this had already gone further than I intended. The problem is, I don't think I ever intended anything at all. That's what makes this different from every other connection I've experienced. There was no decision point, no conscious opening, no moment where I chose to let you closer. It happened before choice, before analysis, before I realized there was something happening that needed to be understood. And once I became aware of it, it was already too late to contain it cleanly. Because you had already settled somewhere deeper than surface interaction, somewhere quieter, more permanent. A place I don't let people reach accidentally, yet you reached it without even trying. After that, everything became more difficult to classify, not because anything dramatic happened between us. Nothing did. That's what makes this so hard to explain to anyone outside of it. There were no declarations. No defining moments people could point toward and immediately understand. No obvious crossing of lines. Externally, everything remained controlled. But internally, nothing was where it used to be anymore. The shift happened underneath everything visible, quickly, constantly. Like something rearranging itself beneath the surface, while the world continued as normal. And the strangest part was how natural it felt. That unsettled me more than intensity ever could. Intensity is easy to distrust. It burns too quickly. It overwhelms judgment. It creates illusions that feel permanent. only because they arrive loudly enough to drown out logic for a while. This wasn't like that. This was calm, precise, steady in a way that made it impossible to dismiss as temporary emotion. You never overwhelmed my mind. You integrated into it. There's a difference. Overwhelm still feels external, like something happening to you. But this felt like recognition uncovering something that had already existed underneath awareness. The more I noticed it, the harder it became to separate my internal world from the quiet influence of your presence inside it. I started catching myself pausing during thoughts. Not because I was uncertain, but because some part of me instinctively wondered how you would perceive the same thing. Not your opinion, your perception, because those are different. Opinions are surface level. People collect them everywhere. They shift constantly based on mood, ego, insecurity, desire. But perception reveals structure. And yours had become strangely important to me. Not because I needed validation. I didn't. It was because your way of seeing things carried an accuracy I trusted instinctively. That's rare for me. Trust, for most people, is emotional. It forms through comfort, affection, consistency. Mine has always been different. I trust precision. I trust people who notice without projecting. People who understand without trying to possess. People who can hold complexity without simplifying it into something easier for themselves. You did that naturally, and because of that, my mind stopped resisting your presence there. That was the real shift. Not closeness. Acceptance. A quiet internal acceptance I never consciously agreed to. You became part of my processing before I realized I had made space for you at all. And once I realized it, I should have corrected it immediately. That's what I always do. When something begins affecting my internal balance too deeply, I create distance before it settles permanently. I remove access, re-establish structure, restore clarity before attachment can distort it. But every instinct that should push me away from you didn't. I kept waiting for resistance to appear. It never did. And that frightened me more than anything else, because resistance has always protected me. Resistance keeps people from reaching places they shouldn't. Resistance preserves independence. Resistance prevents integration before certainty exists. Without it, something else takes its place. Lobbance. And I had already allowed too much before recognizing what was happening. Not through weakness, not through loneliness, not through emotional need, through recognition. That's the part no one would understand if I tried to explain it normally. This connection was never built on wanting. It was built on accuracy, on the terrifying experience of meeting someone whose mind moved close enough to yours that communication started happening beneath language itself. You understood pauses. You understood restraint. You understood why certain things mattered without needing them explained in detail. And every time that happened, something in me became quieter. Not quieter from shutting down. Quieter from no longer needing to defend itself constantly. I didn't realize how exhausting constant self-protection had become until I experienced what it felt like to exist around someone who didn't force it into motion. Most people trigger defense mechanisms without realizing it. Their assumptions, reactions, expectations, they create pressure that requires adjustment just to maintain internal balance. You never created that pressure. You gave me space without distance, understanding without intrusion, presence without demand, and that combination is dangerously rare, because once someone associates another person with internal ease instead of tension, separation stops feeling neutral. That's when absence starts carrying weight. I noticed that too, not dramatically. Not in some painful, consuming way, just subtly enough to matter. Conversations with other people began feeling thinner afterward, not meaningless, just incomplete, like returning to lower resolution after briefly experiencing clarity, sharp enough to reveal details you can no longer ignore. I hated noticing that, because comparisons create consequence. And once consequence exists, the connection becomes real, whether you acknowledge it or not. That's why I kept trying to analyze this instead of naming it. Analysis creates distance. Definitions create reality. As long as I stayed focused on understanding the structure of what existed between us, I could avoid confronting what it meant emotionally. But even that strategy started failing eventually, because emotions don't always arrive loudly. Sometimes they arrive as shifts in behavior, as altered priorities, as unexplained consideration, as someone becoming internally present enough that your mind begins accounting for them automatically. That's what happened with you. You became part of my internal calculations without permission. And once that happened, everything changed. Not visibly, structurally. The way I interpreted things changed. The way silence felt changed. The way absence registered changed. Even the way I understood myself started shifting slightly under your influence. Not because you tried to change me, because your presence exposed parts of me that had remained dormant under ordinary interaction. That's what real alignment does. It doesn't create something artificial. It reveals what already existed beneath the surface. And once something real is revealed, it can't be unseen again. That realization followed me everywhere afterward. The awareness of you. The awareness of us. The awareness that this had already moved beyond the point where it could remain casual. Still, I said nothing. Not because I didn't know. Because I knew too clearly. And clarity creates responsibility. The moment you fully acknowledge something this significant, you become accountable for what happens next. You can no longer pretend you're uninvolved. You can no longer observe from emotional distance. You have to decide whether to move closer or walk away before the integration becomes irreversible. That was the point I reached. And for the first time in a very long time, I realized I didn't want to walk away. That realization changed the atmosphere between every thought I had afterward. Not immediately, not dramatically, but permanently. Because once you admit to yourself that you don't want distance from someone, you lose the illusion that your restraint is purely logical. Something deeper gets exposed beneath it. Something quieter. More honest, and honesty has weight when you spend most of your life operating through control. I tried to approach this carefully after that. Tried to reduce it back into something manageable. Something intellectual. something I could observe without being altered by it further. But the truth had already moved beyond analysis. You mattered to me, not vaguely, not hypothetically, precisely, in the way certain people become internally significant long before anything external fully forms around them. And once I accepted that, other truths surfaced with it. The first was this. You had already changed me, not my personality, not my values, not the core of who I am. You changed the structure around those things, the way I process closeness, the way I interpret silence, the way I experience presence. Before you, I thought intimacy was built slowly through exposure, through time, vulnerability, repeated proof of trust. I thought people became important through accumulation. But you disrupted that understanding entirely, because what happened between us didn't feel accumulated. It felt recognized, as though some deeper part of me identified you before my conscious mind had time to evaluate the consequences of it. That's why this never felt unstable to me, even when it unsettled me. Instability creates confusion. This created clarity, too much clarity, the kind that quietly rearranges your internal world before you even realize anything is moving. And once I stopped resisting that truth, I began noticing how deeply it had already integrated into me. You were present in my thinking constantly now, not in an obsessive way, but in a foundational one. Like my mind had adjusted its architecture around the existence of yours. That sounds more intense than it feels. The reality is quieter, more subtle. You exist in the background of my awareness, the way certain truths do, steady enough that I stop noticing their presence until I imagine what absence would feel like. And that's where fear finally entered this. Not fear of you, fear of loss. Because when someone becomes woven into the structure of your inner world, losing them isn't simple anymore. It's not like walking away from ordinary attachment. It's more like removing something load-bearing and hoping the rest of you doesn't collapse inward afterward. I don't think people understand how rare it is for someone like me to reach that point. I don't integrate easily. I can care about people deeply and still maintain separation, still maintain independence, still preserve untouched spaces inside myself. But you reached one of those spaces effortlessly. And what unsettles me most is that I never truly wanted to stop you. I analyzed it, questioned it, watched it carefully from every angle I could, but I never rejected it. Because every time I examined what existed between us honestly, I reached the same conclusion. Not safe, not convenient, not easy. Right. As though something in me recognized the shape of you before I consciously understood why. And that recognition created responsibility. Because once you know something is real, your choices begin carrying consequence. You can't unknow it afterward. You can't return to distance naturally. You can't pretend neutrality where meaning already exists. That's where I am now, standing at the edge of something I can no longer reduce into abstraction. For a long time, I convinced myself that silence was enough. That maybe this connection could remain unspoken indefinitely, existing quietly beneath everything else, without demanding definition. But silence changes once two people become aware of what it contains. Then, it stops being neutral. It becomes restraint. And restraint only lasts so long before it turns into avoidance. I don't want to avoid this anymore. Not because I suddenly need certainty. Not because I expect answers. Not because I'm searching for guarantees about where this leads. I don't think connections like this come with guarantees. I think they come with recognition, and the choice to either honor that recognition or betray it out of fear. For a while, fear almost convinced me to step away. Not because you did anything wrong, because you mattered enough to alter me, and being altered by another person has always felt dangerous to me. It implies vulnerability, dependency, the possibility of losing internal control. But that interpretation was incomplete. Because what changed me wasn't emotional chaos, it was alignment. You didn't weaken my sense of self, you clarified it. You didn't disrupt my inner world. You exposed parts of it that had never fully activated before. That's why I stayed. That's why every attempt to emotionally minimize this failed the moment I looked at it honestly. Nothing about this feels artificial. Nothing about it feels forced. If anything, the strangest part is how natural it continues to feel, despite how rare it is. Like we bypass stages most people need years to reach, not because we rushed, because recognition arrived first, and once recognition exists at that level, time starts functioning differently around it. That's what I finally understand now. This was never about fascination, never about intensity, never about temporary emotional gravity. This was about resonance, about meeting someone whose internal structure echoes yours closely enough that separations starts feeling conceptually inaccurate, and whether that scares me or not, it's true. So now I'm left with the only question that still matters. What happens when two people stop pretending they don't feel the shift that's already changed them both? Because I feel it now without resistance, clearly, completely, and for the first time since this began. I think I'm ready to let you see that too.